I'm back again on the 1987 944 Turbo. This time I'm working on the dash gauges. Stick around while I remove the gauges from the dash, swap them out on the bench, and get them back in the car. Okay, so why am I tackling this job? Well, myself, along with many other 944 owners, are typically plagued with inaccurate or non-functioning dash gauges. It can be expected these cars are upwards of 35 to 40 plus years old. Wiring is old, it gets corroded, it gets oxidized, and these old gauges work on very specific resistances passing through the electrical system, from the sensors in the car to the gauges themselves. So what exact issues have I been having? Well, let's start from the leftmost side of the gauge pod to the right side. So starting with the left side, that is a dual gauge that shows both the coolant temperature as well as the fuel level. My coolant temperature seems to read fine. In terms of the fuel level gauge, that's a little bit more wonky. That will show the correct fuel level while the car is not running, but I engage. What am I engaging? When I turn the key to position 1. That will show the correct fuel level as long as the car is not running and I have the key turned to position 1. When I start the car, it goes all the way to full level regardless of what the actual level is. Unless I flick the screen, then it seems to go back to the correct level for a couple of seconds before returning all the way to full. So second from the left is the speedometer. Currently, I'm not having any issues with that. It seems to read a little bit off, but that's because I have larger wheels and tires than what comes stock. The odometer as well as the trip odometer seem to be functioning correctly. While the odometer on these cars are known to have issues with the gear that basically disintegrates after time, this gear was changed prior to my ownership. So second from the right is the tachometer. And here's where I've had a couple of issues. On the original tachometer that I had on this car, everything would seem to work fine, except if I'm on a long highway trip. Then all of a sudden, the gauge needle would just start floating, like it didn't know what it was doing. And then it would just go back to normal. So I swapped out that gauge with another gauge from a spare cluster that I've had. That gauge seems to work okay as long as I'm not putting the pedal down to the floor. The harder I get under acceleration, the more the gauge needle will get stuck, anywhere from 2,500 to 4,000 RPMs. It will climb smoothly and then it will get stuck, and then it will jump, and then jump again. The gauge furthest to the right is also a combo gauge. This one holds both oil pressure as well as battery voltage. In terms of my oil pressure gauge, as I've said previously, I have tried 2 different gauges in this car, and both of them do not seem to show the correct readings. My voltage gauge seems to work as it should. Now, one of the other common problems is as these cars age, the orange or reddish markings start to fade. My car seems to have been garage kept for the majority of its life. So the original gauge faces from this car were beautiful. Still a very vibrant orange. And in my attempt to replace them with the spare gauges that I had, I was hoping that they would work and be willing to sacrifice a little bit of fading on those markings. Since I've now swapped out those gauges and really don't see any change, I'm assuming that my problems are probably within the wiring harness itself. It is 37 years old after all. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna swap the original gauges back in this cluster so that they can at least look pretty again, and then I will tackle the wiring harness at a later date. So here are the tools that I'm gonna need to complete this job today. I'm going to start with a T30 bit, and that is to remove the airbag. I'm going to use a short Phillips head and a longer Phillips head. The longer screwdriver is to get to the Phillips head screws by the vents. The shorter Phillips head is for the 3 screws on the top side of the bezel. I'm also going to have a magnet to help get the screws out from behind the vents. Once that is out, then it's time to get the steering wheel off. With the airbag already removed, I have a 24 millimeter socket with an extension and a 1/2-inch ratchet to be able to get the steering wheel nut off. So step 1 will be to disconnect the negative terminal from the battery. I have aftermarket battery terminals, so I have a 10 millimeter lock nut. Depending on what terminals you have on your car, it may be a different size. Now, one of the reasons why I am disconnecting the battery is this car has airbags, and in order to get the gauge cluster out, I need to pull the steering wheel. A little fun fact, in 1987, the Porsche 944 Turbo was the first car in the world to come with dual airbags as standard. They were available on other models, like the S or the naturally aspirated 8-valve cars, but as an option only. But once again, 1987 Turbo, the first car in the world to have dual airbags as standard equipment. So the first step is to remove the airbag. It is very important, once you disconnect the battery, to let the car sit at least 15 minutes to 30 minutes so that this airbag is no longer energized and you won't run the risk of having it blow up in your face. I'm going to remove the airbag by loosening the 2 T30 screws from behind, one located here and one on the other side. Now, obviously, the wiper stalk and the cruise control stalk are in the way, so I'm going to put the key in the ignition, disengage the steering wheel lock, and I'm going to turn the wheel so that I have access. So I have the T30 screws on both sides behind the airbag loosened up. Those are captured bolts, so they do not fall out from behind. And now that it's loose, I should be able to just pop the airbag off and pull out the plug. Next, I'm going to remove the 24mm nut to be able to release the steering wheel. Now that the nut's off, I can remove the steering wheel and then fish the airbag wire through this hole here. Next, I'm going to remove the 4 Phillips head screws for the trim around the clock spring. I've got the clock spring trim off, and now I'm going to focus on the dash gauge bezel, which is a combination of the vents as well as the trim that goes around the gauge bezel. I also have to remove my Redline phone mount, which is secured using one of the same screws that holds in the trim. I'm going to be using the longer screwdriver as well as a magnet to get the screws out. Next, I'm going to use my shorter screwdriver to get the 3 screws on the underside of this trim. Typically, there are also screws under here and under here, but ever since I've had this car, those screws have never been in there, and honestly, there's been no signs of it being less secure, so I just leave them out. So now that all the screws are out, it's time to pop this up and over the clock spring and pop this whole entire trim piece off, as well as my phone mount. So now it's time to remove the gauge pod. There are typically 4 screws, 2 on the left side and 2 on the right side. My bracket is broken, so there is only 3 screws holding on the gauge pod, but I haven't had any issues and it still seems to be secure. So I'm gonna remove those 3 screws and then start to pull out the pod and get the wiring harnesses disconnected. So I have the bezel screws taken out, and now I can move around the gauge bezel. It's important to point out, might be handy to keep a magnet with you. You don't want to drop these screws down into the dash. There's a good chance they might fall down below, but you don't want to spend a whole bunch of time fishing around under the dash for them. So now I'm going to go ahead and remove the gauge pod the best that I can and get access to the 3 connectors in the back. I have the gauge pod removed. Here you can see the big open cavity in the dash. So now let's get this pod over to the bench and get these gauges swapped out. You may have already noticed that my gauge pods do not look like your typical 944 gauge pods, and that's because normally there is a clear shield that goes across the entire thing. I purchased the 911 style gauge bezel kit from Carpokes. This is not sponsored by Carpokes in any way, but if you have a 944 or any Porsche for that matter and you're not on a Carpokes, I highly suggest you check it out. It's a great forum. They have a lot of neat products for all sorts of Porsches, including 3D printed modifications that I think look pretty cool. This kit was not too difficult to install. The installations instructions are extremely easy. However, if you do buy it, I suggest you read through the entire set of instructions before you start the job, just to make sure you've got a full understanding of how it works. So instead of having one clear shield, each individual gauge now has its own polycarbonate lens. Along with that, it has what I consider probably the best LED lighting kit, and it really helps make this gauge pod super easy to see at nighttime. Okay, now it's time to separate the bezel around the gauges from the actual circuitry and the gauges themselves. Here you can see what was my spare set of gauges, but these are actually a lot of the original gauges that came on the car. And as you can see, the orange markings are still nice and clear. So I'm going to be swapping these gauges back onto this gauge bezel. The first step is to remove all of the screws along the back side, and then you can pull the housing away from the bezel. I'm going to start with the tachometer. There's a number of 7mm nuts that have to come off, as well as 3 flathead screws. Once I have those off, I'm going to carefully pull the tachometer out of the base and set it aside. I have all the gauges replaced. One thing to note is the gauges on the outsides, they have what they call footballs. It's really just 2 nuts that come off. You pop these off and then the gauges slide right out. It's the same for the coolant temperature and the fuel gauge as it is the oil pressure and voltage. So the next step is to clean up these lenses, make sure they're nice and clean, attach them to the gauge pod, and then it goes back in the car. And there you have it. Gauges have been replaced. They are back in the bezel. Now it's time to get this back in the car. So getting the connectors back on the bezel can be a little bit of a nightmare. It's not impossible, obviously, but it can be a bit of a pain. So the key is to realize that the connectors have locks on them. You can see here, if you rotate that hinge, you can see the lock on both sides. So you want these levers to be facing outward first, and then when you plug it in, you pull them in to lock it snug. And there's one here, and then 2 on the right side or the passenger side that go in behind. So I'm gonna get those in, and then we'll get it bolted in and go from there. I have the cluster screwed in. All of the connectors are secured on the back. So next it's time to get the bezel in that goes all the way around. One thing to point out is you wanna make sure that this is in the right position. This is basically the magnet that resets the trip odometer. There is a button within the surround that when you push on it, it touches against this magnet and triggers the trip odometer reset. So we want to make sure that this does not move. I also have to fish in the phone mount that I have that goes right here. I have the gauge bezel trim back in. So one tip is when you get the screws in, do not tighten them down all the way, because there's a couple of things that could go wrong. One, you could drop one of the screws and have to remove the whole trim again to be able to fish it out. Or 2, the clips that the screws go into may have shifted. And if that happens, then the screws will not be able to go in. So I just make sure to get the screws started until I make sure that I have all 3 in there, and then I will go ahead and tighten them down. And this is the trip odometer reset. Once you get it in, make sure that the spring works, and you can feel when it makes contact with that piece behind it that I showed earlier. So the next step is to get the 3 screws under here in, and then I will move on to the trim around the clock spring. The trim around the clock spring is installed. Now it's time to put the steering wheel on. One thing I should have pointed out earlier is you want to make sure to mark the steering wheel shaft along with your steering wheel to make sure that it goes back in the same spot so your wheel isn't cockeyed while you're driving down the road. So I'm going to get the wheel on, and then we move to the airbag. I have the steering wheel bolted on, so next it's time to put the airbag in. You basically just put the plug into the back of the airbag, and these are those captured bolts that I was talking about earlier. That's what secures the airbags in, one on each side. So once the airbag is in, you go back with your T30 and tighten these up, and then we're ready to connect the battery. So the airbag is back in and secured. So now the next step is to reconnect the battery, fire it up, and make sure that all the gauges are actually working. All right, the battery is connected, so let's fire it up and see if these gauges are actually working. Looks like the tachometer is working as it's supposed to. The fuel gauge is actually where it's supposed to be. Voltage looks okay. Now the motor is cold, so my oil pressure should be up around 5, but that is basically the same level that both gauges I've tried. I think there could be something wrong with the wiring, unless that is the true oil pressure. As you saw in one of my previous videos, I did swap out the oil pressure sending unit, but as of right now, I'm happy. I consider this job successful. I'll take it for a drive and see if there's still any issue with the tachometer when it gets between like 3,000 and 5,000 RPMs. But outside of that, I think job is done. So job done. Not the most difficult thing in the world, not super easy either. You just got to take your time, know what screws you need to remove, and you'll be fine. Obviously, it's electrical components, so you do need to be careful, especially when you're removing the connectors on the back of the gauges. So if you have one of these 944s with the updated dash, so that's any 944 that's 1985 and a half or newer, hopefully this was helpful. It makes it a little easier if you need to remove your gauges. So now that I'm done, I'm going to shut that hood and take that car out for a ride and enjoy it. So if you found this helpful, please give this video a like. Please consider subscribing, share with your friends, and hit that notification bell so you can be notified when I upload more videos, not only of this 944 Turbo, but other videos to show that you don't have to be a professional to tackle a lot of these jobs yourself. So with that, I'll catch you on the next one.